Dr. Carl Geller had always been a little offbeat. There were people who followed the rules, and then there were people who bent them until the laws of physics themselves looked like they were suffering from a bad case of whiplash. Carl was the latter. It was a crisp October morning in Nevada when everything changed. The kind of morning that seemed too quiet, too still, for the kind of chaos that was about to unfold in the hidden laboratory nestled in the desert. The air smelled of ozone and burnt coffee, which was probably because Carl's laboratory had recently been the scene of an electrical meltdown. But that wasn't the problem today. Today, the real disaster was being orchestrated by something much, much smaller. Carl stood before the glowing array of equipment, a mess of wires and instruments connected to a cylindrical container that was labeled, "Caution, Extreme Gravitational Flux." He was too focused on his thoughts to care. The air hummed with a low, constant vibration. His glasses perched on the end of his nose, one arm slightly bent, as he bent over a clipboard scribbling down notes. A microscopic black hole particle, less than the size of a speck of dust, was now sealed inside the machine. This was the moment he'd been working for. A breakthrough that could change everything. If it didn't kill him first, Carl, came the voice of his colleague, Dr. Emily Price, pulling him back from his reverie. Emily was a physicist too, but her specialty was quantum mechanics. Where Carl was often lost in the abstract, Emily was grounded in the practical. It was a good balance, but right now, she wasn't impressed. "Are you sure about this? I'm not saying it won't work, but black holes are unstable." Carl looked up, adjusting his glasses. "That's why I'm trying to stabilize them. If we can harness the energy of a black hole without letting it collapse, we could solve the energy crisis. The entire world would change. Think about it, Emily. Free energy. Unlimited power." Emily folded her arms. "You're talking about controlling one of the most dangerous forces in the universe like it's a pet hamster. And I'm not sure it's a good idea to test this right now." She gave him a pointed look, eyes narrowing in skepticism, but Carl was in the zone. He had never been more convinced of anything in his life. The experiment had been months in the making, and failure wasn't an option. He smiled at Emily, his usual mix of cockiness and charm. "That's why I need you here, Em. To make sure I don't accidentally blow up the world." She sighed, but she stayed. "Fine. But if you end up eating your own hair with a black hole in your stomach, don't say I didn't warn you." Carl chuckled as he flicked the switch. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. The equipment hummed, the machine lights blinked like tiny stars in a far-off galaxy, and then, pop, the tiniest of black holes blinked into existence inside the containment chamber. It wasn't much more than a speck of darkness, barely visible to the human eye, but Carl knew what it was. He could feel the energy swirling in the air around him. It was exhilarating, almost intoxicating. He stepped forward, hands hovering over the control panel, heart racing. "Here we go. Let's see if we can keep this little guy stable." That was when it happened. Carl inhaled sharply. The air around him shifted. He felt it first in his chest, a strange, heavy sensation, followed by an unmistakable, all-consuming lightness. The entire room seemed to tilt for a second, and then, suddenly, the floor was no longer beneath him. His feet had left the ground. "What the?" he muttered, reaching for the desk to steady himself. It was no use. The room began to distort around him. The weightlessness was like being caught in the middle of a storm, and every object in sight seemed to obey a strange gravitational pull. "Emily," he called out, but his voice was swallowed up by the sensation of his own body floating higher and higher into the air. A chair near him drifted upward, like a leaf in the wind. His coffee mug followed suit, spinning slowly above his head like some forgotten satellite. Emily's voice came from the other side of the room, strained. "Carl. What the hell is happening? I think it worked." His voice trailed off as he watched the machine, which was supposed to be containing the black hole, now pulsing with an ominous energy. The tiny black hole inside had expanded, just a little. But the expansion wasn't the problem. The problem was that everything else was also expanding. And contracting. Objects around the lab began floating. Metal shavings, pens, even paper clips, all began to defy gravity and levitate in the air. I'm not supposed to be floating, right? Carl asked, half laughing, half panicked. Get down, Carl. But it was too late. He was already tumbling through the air, flipping head over heels, like a child's balloon caught in the wind. His body was no longer just affected by the gravitational anomaly, he was the anomaly. There was no up, no down, just the feeling of constant motion. He was like an astronaut who had forgotten to bring a tether to the space station, floating freely. A sudden, violent force yanked him back toward the ceiling, and he collided with a stack of papers that, for some reason, had been drifting upwards as well. He bounced off the ceiling, barely able to comprehend what was happening to his body. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pull stopped. He floated in midair, disoriented and utterly helpless. What the hell just happened? Emily asked, her voice close to a scream. She had also been swept into the air, but unlike Carl, she seemed to be stuck, spinning slowly, held by some unseen force like a child's toy on a string. Her arms flailed out helplessly. Carl. This is not how physics works. Carl could only laugh, albeit nervously. It's working just fine, I think. I'm not sure what I just did, but, hey, did you see that? I think I just made gravity my bitch. I'm not impressed, Carl, Emily replied, her voice tight with panic. You're floating. You don't get to make puns when you're defying basic laws of nature. Carl waved his hand in front of him, causing several pens to float toward him like obedient pets. He smiled. You know, I always wanted to be able to control gravity. It was one of those childhood dreams. Emily wasn't laughing anymore. She was staring at the containment chamber, which had begun to rattle. The black hole inside was growing larger, and the energy field around it had started to pulse erratically. The equipment around them began to crackle, and sparks flew from the edges of the machine. Carl, shut it down. This is getting out of control. Emily shouted. Carl glanced at the control panel, trying to focus through the dizziness in his head. He wasn't sure how to reverse the process. He wasn't even sure what had gone wrong in the first place. The black hole was supposed to be contained, he had made sure of that. But now it seemed as though the black hole was not just eating up the lab, it was eating everything that he tried to reach the console, but his body was still caught in the strange gravitational flux. His fingers brushed against a button, but his hand kept floating away before he could press it. Damn it, he muttered. This was not in the plan. And then, the inevitable happened, the black hole expanded beyond containment. A shockwave of gravitational force shot through the lab, distorting the space around them, sending equipment crashing into walls. The containment chamber cracked open like an eggshell under the pressure. Emily screamed. We need to get out of here. Now. But it was too late. The black hole had started pulling everything toward it, the desks, the chairs, the walls themselves. The very air was warping. The space between objects seemed to distort, and Carl felt himself being sucked into it like a ragdoll caught in a vacuum. Then, everything went black, the world seemed to collapse into a singularity. Carl's consciousness was caught in an infinite loop, spiraling through a disorienting array of shifting perspectives. One moment, he was floating in the lab, weightless, helpless. The next, he was plummeting through space, through time, through everything and nothing at once. The floor, the ceiling, the walls, even Emily's frantic face, all distorted into a vortex that sucked him deeper into the maelstrom of reality bending around him. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped, the disorientation cleared, leaving him with a single, horrible realization. He was no longer in the lab. At least, not the lab he knew. He blinked, trying to focus. His body was slumped against something solid, but everything around him was wrong. The air shimmered with an unnatural, deep violet hue. It wasn't the dry desert heat he was used to. There were no buzzing fluorescent lights overhead or the hum of the containment machine. No sound at all, just a vast, eerie silence that made his ears ring. "Emily," he whispered hoarsely, though he wasn't sure why. He couldn't hear anything. Not even his own voice. He tried to stand, but his legs felt heavy. His head, still swimming in a kind of cosmic dizziness, refused to cooperate. When he did manage to push himself up, it felt as though he were underwater, the world stretching and pulling around him. His vision was warped, as if he were seeing through a thick fog or, worse, some kind of time dilation. Shapes moved at odd speeds, flashing in and out of existence like distorted reflections in a shattered mirror. He staggered to his feet, heart pounding. He wasn't sure what had happened or how long it had been. Had he been unconscious? Had he lost time? A sudden flare of panic set his pulse racing. His thoughts scattered. He couldn't think clearly. The air around him crackled, and then, in an instant, the scene changed again. The violet haze was gone, replaced by the stark, harsh light of the lab, but it wasn't right. It was as though the very structure of the building had been twisted, reshaped by the immense force of the black hole. The walls were buckling inwards, the air swirling with a gravitational pull that bent reality into grotesque, jagged angles. Items floated helplessly in midair, like space debris caught in the aftermath of a collision. The floor itself was warped, an undulating mass that seemed to breathe, as though the building was alive, reacting to the strain of the black hole's force. Carl could hear distant voices now, echoing in the warped space around him. His mind grasped for meaning, but all he could do was struggle to breathe, each inhale feeling like it was stretching across infinite dimensions. "Emily?" He finally managed, his voice louder this time, though it felt distant and strange, and then, she appeared. Emily was floating in the air, caught in some impossible space where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. Her eyes locked onto his, and Carl could see the panic reflected there, though she was still trying to remain calm, trying to make sense of the chaos. She was hovering just above the ground, like some kind of astronaut, her arms and legs spread out for balance. "You're okay?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. "What happened? Where are we?" Carl shook his head, his mind racing, still too disoriented to comprehend the full extent of the situation. "I don't know." He stopped, looking around. There was something about the space they were in. Something off about it. It felt like time was slipping away, as if the very fabric of existence was unraveling around him. The black hole's influence had extended far beyond the lab, far beyond what anyone could have predicted. It wasn't just pulling in objects anymore, it was pulling in time. Carl closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The gravitational distortion had warped the very fabric of reality. The world had become unstable, fragile, as though each moment was on the brink of shattering into 1,000 different possibilities. The laws of physics were no longer predictable. The very core of spacetime was being twisted apart, and he was the center of it all. "How long do we have?" Emily asked, her eyes frantic. She was floating closer now, reaching out a hand to steady him. Carl wasn't sure. The longer they stayed here, the more unpredictable the effects would be. He could feel the black hole inside him, the engine that was constantly sucking in energy and mass, threatening to become unstable. It was a part of him now, he could sense its gravitational pull, its hunger. I don't know," he said. "It's worse than I thought. The black hole, it's growing. It's pulling everything in, everything, not just the lab. If this keeps up, it could start pulling in entire cities, the whole planet." "No," Emily interrupted, her eyes wide. "It can't be. It can't have that kind of power." Carl shook his head, frustration building. "Emily, I don't think you understand. This thing isn't just a black hole anymore. It's an engine, inside me. And it's not just absorbing matter, it's absorbing time. The laws of physics are breaking down. Every moment here is unstable. He stopped again, his thoughts racing too fast for him to catch up. We have to stop it. But I don't know how. If I don't, his voice trailed off as he felt it again, the black hole shifting inside him, expanding like some great cosmic beast, threatening to tear apart the space-time continuum. What happens if you can't stop it? Emily asked softly, fear in her eyes. Carl turned away from her, the weight of what he was about to say choking him. Everything. There was a long silence. Emily floated beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if to hold herself together. She looked like she was bracing for a storm, waiting for the inevitable to strike. Carl, on the other hand, was already spiraling into it. He could feel the pressure mounting, the tug of the black hole pulling at his insides. It wasn't just gravity. It was something deeper, something ancient and unknowable. A force that defied understanding. And now it was a part of him, a ticking time bomb strapped to his own body. He could sense the universe bending around him. Every second was a moment closer to collapse. Okay, he said, his voice cracking slightly. We need to get out of here. We need to get to the backup facility. It's the only place that might have the equipment we need to fix this. Emily nodded. Right. The backup facility. But how do we get there? You saw what happened to the lab, it's all disintegrating. We won't make it through the... Carl raised his hand, cutting her off. I can control it, he said, more confidently than he felt. For now. But we don't have long. The longer we stay in this place, the more unstable it becomes. With a shaky breath, Carl focused, summoning all of his willpower. He reached inside himself, feeling the black hole's gravity pull at his core. It was like trying to hold a storm in his hands, but he had no choice. He had to fight it. The space around them shuddered as he released a wave of controlled energy, a force that pushed outward from his body in an attempt to stabilize the gravitational field. The room around them creaked, groaned, and for a moment, it seemed like the whole structure would crumble. But then, just as quickly, it stopped. Emily blinked, a look of disbelief crossing her face. You did it? I don't know, Carl replied. I only have a little control. But we don't have much time. We need to move, now. They began to move through the distorted space, carefully navigating through floating debris and unstable corridors. The air was thick with tension, each step feeling like they were walking through a dream, or a nightmare. Time was slipping away faster than they could comprehend. As they neared the backup facility, the world around them began to shift once again, and the ground cracked beneath their feet. The gravitational force intensified. They were getting closer to the center of the disturbance. Carl could feel it, the black hole's hunger. They reached the entrance to the backup facility, but before they could step inside, everything went dark. The darkness that enveloped them wasn't like the familiar blackness of a power outage or the deep shadows of a night sky. It was more like the absence of everything. There was no sound. No light. No feeling, no weight, no direction. Just a vacuum, the kind that echoed with the absence of existence. Carl reached out, his hand slicing through the nothingness. His breath was ragged, and every heartbeat felt louder in his ears, as though he were fighting against the very fabric of space and time. Emily? His voice barely made it past his lips. It was as if the darkness swallowed his words before they could leave his mouth. A tremor of panic hit him in the chest, but he forced it down. Stay calm. He had no idea what had happened or where they were, but he couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not with the black hole inside him still threatening to tear everything apart. He reached for the small pocket device that held the emergency beacon. He could feel it in his hand, a tiny weight, but the familiar hum of the device wasn't there. He should have felt its vibration, its pulse, anything to tell him it was working, but there was nothing. "Emily," he called again, this time with more urgency. But his voice sounded so distant, so far removed from him, that he might as well have shouted into a vacuum, and then, just as the silence began to stretch its claws around him, the world snapped back into place, the backup facility, finally. Carl was aware of the sensation of his feet touching the ground, solid ground, though it felt like the floor was shifting slightly beneath him. His surroundings were dim, lit by emergency lighting that flickered weakly overhead, casting long, trembling shadows across the metal walls. Emily was beside him, as disoriented as he was. She was steadying herself against the wall, her breathing shallow and quick. "What happened?" she asked, voice tight with a mix of fear and exhaustion. "Where?" "I think we just slipped through the fabric of time," Carl said, his voice shaky as he tried to adjust to the gravity, real, actual gravity that no longer bent and warped under the influence of the black hole. He could still feel it inside him, pulsing with its dangerous power, but the external world was stable again. For now. A low, growling hum suddenly echoed in the distance, the sound of machinery powering up. Carl's head snapped toward the source of the noise. The backup facility systems were coming online, which was a good sign. But it also meant that the clock was ticking faster than ever. Emily's hand found his arm, gripping it tightly. "Carl, we don't have much time, do we?" Carl took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "No. We don't. The black hole inside me. It's getting stronger. And as it grows, it's pulling more and more, matter, energy, time, everything's destabilizing. Then what are we supposed to do?" Emily's voice was raw, but it was still full of that grounded practicality that Carl had always admired. "You're the one who got us into this mess, Carl. You're the one who's going to get us out." He looked at her, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "I don't know if I can." But that wasn't entirely true. He did know what had to be done, or at least part of it. The backup facility housed equipment that could potentially stabilize the gravitational anomalies, but that equipment was designed to contain a black hole, not to create one. Carl had no idea if the machines in there could withstand the strain of a black hole contained inside a human body. He shook his head, trying to focus. He needed to move. "We need to get to the central core. That's where the equipment is. We don't have much time." They started toward the hallway that led deeper into the facility, the hum of machinery growing louder with every step. Carl's stomach churned. The black hole inside him was pulling on his insides like a vice, and the effort of moving was beginning to feel like trying to drag a mountain up a cliff. Each step felt heavier, the air growing denser, thicker with the energy of the facility. The walls seemed to ripple with the energy of the equipment, like the whole building was alive, feeding off the gravitational pull of the black hole. Carl could feel the tug of the distortion intensifying, threatening to stretch reality thin again. He glanced at Emily, who was still walking beside him, though her steps seemed heavier now. Her eyes were glued to the corridor ahead, her mind clearly working through all the calculations, all the possibilities. She was trying to figure out a way out. But Carl had no illusions. He knew the truth, there was no way out of this. The black hole was inside him, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed everything around them. The door to the central control room loomed ahead, and Carl pushed it open with a grunt. Inside, the facility's control panel was alive with blinking lights, graphs, and readouts, each one more chaotic than the last. The gravity was pulling in every direction, distorting the data on the screens, making it impossible to make sense of anything. Carl's head swam as he approached the main console. He could feel the pull of the black hole again, sharper this time. He wasn't sure if it was because they were so close to the heart of the facility or because the black hole was starting to pull on the energy around them. Either way, it was getting worse. The center of the room began to spin, like a carousel on the verge of coming apart. "I can't think straight," Carl muttered, his hand trembling as he hovered over the control panel. Emily stepped up beside him. "Do you need me to?" "No," Carl interrupted, raising his hand. He couldn't explain it, but something in him snapped into place. His mind cleared, and suddenly he was focused. He could feel the black hole inside him like a ticking bomb, but he also felt something else, the solution, though it was still blurry, still out of reach. He slammed his hand onto the central control panel, sending a pulse of energy through the equipment. The whole room seemed to hum, vibrating with the force of the energy. The machines lit up in a cascade of sparks, but it wasn't enough. "Not nearly enough. I need to get closer," Carl said, his voice strained. Emily tried to stop him, her hand reaching out. "What are you doing?" Carl, no, but it was too late. He could feel it now, the machinery, the energy inside him, the pull of the black hole, and he knew, with terrible clarity, what he had to do. He stepped forward, right into the center of the machine's control hub. The energy that surrounded him was like a storm, wild and unpredictable, and the gravitational field seemed to twist around him. For a brief moment, he felt as if he were standing at the edge of the universe, his feet no longer in contact with anything solid. He could sense the fabric of reality bending around him. "Carl!" Emily screamed, her voice frantic. "Get out of there!" But Carl couldn't hear her anymore. He wasn't listening. His body was already pulled into the heart of the machine, his hands pressing against the control panels, trying to sync with the fluctuating waves of energy. He could feel his own pulse echoing in time with the black hole inside him, and for a moment, it felt like the universe was holding its breath. Then, everything shifted. A massive surge of energy shot out from the core, and the gravitational field around Carl stabilized for the briefest of moments. The distortion began to fade, the chaos receding like a storm that had suddenly lost its strength. The air cleared, the machines powered down, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Carl could breathe again. He sank to his knees, gasping for air. The world around him slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Emily was standing beside him now, her eyes wide, her breath coming in quick bursts. "Carl, what did you?" He raised his hand, cutting her off. "I fixed it," he said, his voice hoarse. "For now. But we're not out of the woods yet. The black hole's still inside me. And it's still hungry." The room was silent for a moment. But in that silence, Carl knew they had a little more time, just enough to figure out how to contain it before it tore everything apart. But for now, they had survived.